Ankit, I'll give you a bit of context again. So, the reason why we decided to start off this series is to have a platform where we can bring together top finance leaders in the Middle East to discuss and share insights on the future of finance in the region. And that's exactly what we're going to do here today.
Sure, let's go for it.
Okay, so Ankit, I was going through your LinkedIn and you've had an impressive career moving from consulting at KPMG and Deloitte to leading finance teams at fast growing startups like Careem, One Tech Capital, and now Silkhaus. So, how did your role evolve as you moved from consulting to the executive level?
I think you're right. It's been quite a transition, working with the large consulting firms and then dealing with like multi-billion dollar companies as clients, and then shifting focus to startups and the different kind of problems that they have. I think the biggest change I would say between the two is the transition in focus. Like when you're consulting, you're advising on the strategy based on the best practices, of the industry, based on the best practices of the process. And then you're giving them a roadmap, so to speak. Like you are not really accountable for the execution of it. And you don't necessarily understand the execution risk. When you work in an executive role, right, and particularly with a startup, I think your mind shifts completely from just the best business practices to in-depth knowledge of the processes, in-depth knowledge of the company and the industry that it operates in. You need to make quick decisions, and a lot of times it's based on imperfect data, imperfect information. Yeah, you always crunch for resources and timing. And what you end up realizing is the resilience that you need to build up. That's the one of the skills that you kind of develop over time with the startups, because you've tried once based on the original strategy, it does not work, but you still need to continue to plow through. And that's when you need to adapt and change, and you kind of keep the focus of the company in mind, which is not something that you I'd seen, at least in consulting, because once you give them the strategy to play with, usually some of these challenges don't surface until they get into the execution mode few months or few years down the road.
No, I think I completely agree. I've also seen this at Alan because both our founders, co-founders are from consulting, Parthi and Karun, both from McKinsey. And now, now that they're in a startup, this is what they tell us as well, that execution is something that you learn hands-on once you start building a startup, working for a startup. So completely agreed on that bit. Moving to the next question, your work spans multiple industries, including real estate tech, retail, and corporate development. So, how do you adapt your financial strategy to different sectors? Do you think it differs if you're in different industries, especially when there are unique challenges in each?
Absolutely. I think each industry, each business, or even within the each business, each revenue line probably has a different mechanics to it, right? So you need to develop the industry specific insights and the business specific insights. Very simply put, as a CFO, like what you want to control is the revenue and the cost structure in each sector, which means that you need to have a good handle on what the key drivers are for each of these elements. These differ dramatically between fast-growing startup like Careem, for instance, where we were able to scale across 15 different countries in the geography, and each user, the number of times it repeats the transaction, is how you actually end up monetizing, right? As opposed to Silk House, where it's not the frequency of the transaction that matters, but the quantum of the spend, right? So you'd rather want them to stay as long as possible, as much as possible, as opposed to saying, every 2 days. So there is a bit of short-term rental mix to it, which is different from what you'd consider as a typical e-commerce or typical tech-based company. But overall, I think it's important to get a handle on what these key drivers are for each of the sectors. And then you need to be agile enough to adapt to it, right? There's always the nuances that each function brings, each business brings. You need to be able to adapt to it.
Very well said. Let's go on to the next question. So, I also saw that, like you mentioned, you worked at Kareem, but you also worked at Snapdeal, both of which are, big names. And both of them have undergone significant growth and transformation. What are some of the key lessons you took from those experiences, and how do you bring them into your work today at Silk House?
You're right. Both of them are extremely different and very rewarding in terms of learning. If I were to just present the key highlights, right? At Kareem, they built value on the basis of doing business where nobody else really wanted to. So, for instance, when we got into Iraq, it wasn't the easiest country to do businesses. We got into Sudan, we got into Algeria. None of these are geographies where people felt they were comfortable, to go into. Karim realized that if we are able to crack these markets, and there's significant value to be created. And not just that, right? Like even Middle East, starting a tech firm in Middle East wasn't, as novel as it is now, right? Oh, it was pretty novel back then compared to now. So from that perspective, the way I think of Kareem is like you're taking on challenges, calculated risks, and then creating value. There is an advantage on being the first mover. Comes with a lot of struggle. There's always the first time you're doing this, and not just for the company, right? Sometimes even in the industry, with the regulators, for instance, a very different mindset that you've got to work with. I think that's been one of the significant learnings for Kareem in my mind. With Snapdeal, probably position it a bit different. Even though we were early in the e-commerce space in India back then, I think one of the biggest learnings came when things didn't really go our well, particularly with funding environment, right? Which means the only thing that we really needed to focus was on unit economics and was on cost structure. And that was relentless focus from the management. I mean, I was too young in the company back then to really take credit for it. But what I could see from them is relentless focus. Like every day we'd meet with the CEO just to see, okay, what all do we need to do? How do we extend the runway? How do we extend the run? And I think it's things like those actions that we took during those times that have made it resilient and it still survives. It's been a long time since I left Snapdeal, but it's still running well. One of its portfolio companies just went public, so clearly, there is a turnaround story to be learned from.
What time were you there at Snapdeal?
From 2014 to 2017.
Yeah, that's a long time. And Kareem?
Kareem, I was there from 2018 to 2020.
18 to 2020. I think I was also at Kareem around that time. What geographies did you look at back then?
So I was part of the corporate development team. So our role was essentially to build on adjacent businesses. So if you remember, all of these, like Kareem Bikes came through an acquisition, right?
Yeah.
Kareem Food delivery business came through an acquisition. Back then, we started Kareem Bus in Egypt, which came through an acquisition. So the idea was there's a core business, but there's also the element of new businesses in each geography that we can look at. So it could be Dubai, it could be Saudi, it could be Egypt. We looked at a lot of different companies and across the geography, right from Turkey to Pakistan.
Okay, yeah. So around the time when I was at Kareem, they launched Kareem Food in Pakistan. Didn't perform very well because Food Panda was there, so they had a huge grip on the market. And I was a part of the sales slash customer success team at the time. But I think the experience working at a company like Kareem, it's always, really good.
And I also feel that when things go really smooth, there's not enough learnings. It's
Right.
only when things go really bad, right? That's when you kind of have to adapt. You have to reflect as to what went right, what went wrong, how do we double down, how do we adapt to it. And that's pretty exciting if you ask me.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like that time, I still remember I was a student back then, and I still remember like every day going from university just, to work for hours and then back to university, then back to the office, and then going to all these restaurants, meeting all these different people. I still remember that time, and it was like some good times that I spent at Kareem.
Absolutely.
So at Silk House, we've discussed that you've been a part of a high growth environment. How do you handle the financial challenges of scaling a business quickly, particularly around cash flow, budgeting, and managing operational expenses?
I think the way to position this is at a very high growth startup, right? There's always a fight between high growth versus efficient growth, and at Silkhouse we've been able to do that really well. So one of the key ways to do this is to keep an eye on the cash flow management. You need to prioritize liquidity, right? We're not living in an environment where there's abundance of resources available, but when you do have the liquidity, you need to basically allocate it correctly, right? And allocate it best in the long term interest of the company. People do get excited about the short term growth, and there's always this balance you need to play short term growth versus the long term success of the company. And that's what we end up doing at Silk House. So when it comes to cash flow management, right, we prioritize liquidity, we organize the working capital, we work with multiple scenarios. For instance, we even take it to the board in the sense that these are the couple of scenarios that we have in mind. One is more efficient growth, the other is a little bit more aggressive growth, and these are the pros and cons of each, right? Let's understand the risk and then let's take a call accordingly. Now, we may differ in views as to what is the right move ahead, but once we get out of a room, then we all have to be aligned as a leadership team because then it comes down to the execution. And that's what really matters. So once you have a sense, once everybody understands why we need to prioritize one over the other, then you're working with a smart group of people who will make it happen. So, and then they will focus on the operational efficiencies. They'll focus on the processes that we need to streamline to make sure that we're able to hit the target and still grow efficiently.
I have a question to ask you. So, historically, CFOs or finance directors or, anyone in a senior position in finance is looked as gatekeepers, right? So, would you say that's what your role is, or would you say that senior leadership in finance is now moving away from the gatekeeper role?
I think it's not just in finance, across the board, senior leadership, I would say, is moving away from being a gatekeeper. And that has a very negative connotation to it, right? What I
Yeah.
would typically see is senior leadership, particularly the CFOs. The role that they play is a collaborative leader. They need to be a lot more collaborative with all the department heads, all the stakeholders. Our job as a CFO is not to just control the spend, right? It is basically to provide the data driven insights that we can bring to the table. Like I said before, if you have the right team and you give them the right reasons to focus on, then they will provide the actionable insights to you as well. It's not just your role to provide the actionable insights, right? There will be times where you may not fully comprehend the challenges of the other department. So unless you are in a very collaborative environment, it becomes me versus you, and that's not really productive for anyone. So I think as long as you have a very clear view on what the company's goals are, you are able to show with the data, here is why one makes sense versus the other. And then you have a very open communication with all the stakeholders, including the leaders from the other departments as well. That's when you come up with really actionable insights, and that's when you can really focus on executing.
In your experience, do you think having this approach, you've had other departments be reciprocative of the process when you sit and, discuss with them?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because I think it is very clear that we're all working towards the same goal. Now, that misalignment comes when you're working with a different mindset. You're working with a different goal, and it's like, hey, this is my department's goal, and this is my department's goal. But the senior leadership has to be aligned so that we have a very open culture. It's a very flat organization, and the information is shared, relatively openly within the leaders, right? And hence, that makes it very easy for us to convince the leadership to say, yes, this is the goal. This is what we need to align towards. And it's like they say, right? The best idea wins. You may not have the best approach in terms of how to achieve those goals, but someone who is working within a particular department knows the ins and out of it a lot more effectively. Maybe their idea is better than yours, which means that you have to be open to collaboration. It has to be a two-way street.
Agreed. No, totally makes sense. Okay, so Ankit, we're seeing a lot of talk about AI and digital transformation in finance. How do you think these technologies are shaping the future of finance?
I think historically, if you see a big piece of finance, let's say accounting, that's a big element of finance. A lot of the accounting work is repetitive tasks,
Yeah.
right? I'm seeing the use of AI in helping with these repetitive tasks. So if you can streamline these repetitive tasks, such as reporting, reconciliation, that makes the team a lot more efficient, right? Then you can focus on some insights that you develop. You can focus on, some of the other strategic ideas that you can develop. And I think that's one big role that AI can play within finance. The second big role that I feel it can play is the predictive analytics. So, for instance, in our industry, we have guests staying with us. There might be times where we need to understand the needs of the guest, right? As to what is required over there. If it's a family, they might have a different requirement. If someone's traveling for business, they have a different requirement, which means that the cost of servicing that request could be different as well. And through predictive analysis, we can then actually have a better grasp on the cash flow. We understand this is a long-term guess for a B2B. Here is what we can expect from there, right? And then we can plan for the cash flow accordingly. This helps us with the better forecasting. It helps us with the better decision making, and that overall streamline the effort required for the company as well. And the third big piece that I think we'll start seeing is the real time reporting. What typically used to happen is on a daily, weekly, or a monthly basis, right? A certain time period, you look at the reports, and then someone using the knowledge and the ability to kind of say, okay, fine, based on this report, here are the challenges that we see, here are the pros that we see. All of that can be automated, right? And it doesn't need to be done on a regular routine basis as a weekly frequency or a monthly frequency. It can be real time as well. And I think that's something that AI can really help with the finances.
Also, tell me, do you think startups have a competitive edge over larger companies when it comes to adopting new technologies like AI? What's your view on how tech adoption can drive growth in a fast-paced startup environment?
That's interesting. So I think from a large company is compared to a startup, one of the biggest advantages that a large company has is the availability of data. Most of these models rely on the data. And the more data you feed it, more accurate the predictions are, more better and insightful the analysis are. So I think from that perspective, clearly the large companies have an edge. Now, one way for a startup to come around that is to be agile, almost like the 80-20 principle. Let's focus on the 20% of the effort required that will provide you with the 80% of the output. And then take a call on it that, oh, is this effective? Let's drill it a little bit deeper. If it's not effective, then it's easy for us to change the process. It's easy for us to change the system, which is not something that the large companies can easily do, right?
Yeah.
So agility becomes an asset that the large companies are unable to, lean on. If you have an experimentation culture within the startup that allows you to define a hypothesis very clearly, execute on it, and fail fast. Fail small, fail fast, and be quick to iterate on that experiment. These are some of the things that I don't think the large companies will be able to do as effectively as a startup can. And that's the advantage that I think the startups have when it comes to adapting to new technologies.
Tell me about the technologies that, you guys have adopted at Silkhaus at the moment. What are some of the tools that you're using and how have they helped in your financial operations?
So I think at Silkhouse, right, there are a couple of basic things where the way I look at technology, it's a building block. Like you need to have certain crucial technologies in place as a base layer, and then you start building on top of it. So over the last year, we've just adapted ERP system, which basically becomes your information source, right? That's the ultimate truth. So for us to be able to do anything on top of it, we need to first get a handle on the ERP system, which we now have. The second step is now reporting. So we've invested in reporting tools that help us develop key insights based on the information in the ERP system. And then the third becomes the AI and the machine learning tools, right? So basis what we have in the system currently, basis what we are reporting currently, then we can layer it up with the AI and the machine learning tools, which will improve our forecasting ability, which will help us detect the anomaly very early on as well, and react to it. What we're also very mindful is, given how things change rapidly, you want to have the flexibility of a cloud-based solution. You don't want to be tied up with something in-house that you need to maintain over time as well. Right? The cloud-based systems are great. Simpler, the better. You can use them, adapt to it, and that's something that is going to be our focus in 2025 as well. Anything to do with AI and machine learning that can be built on top of the ERP systems would be the right way to go for us. So I think we are still in the early stage of AI, if you ask me. Right? It's still early stage of technologies that can help us move towards that AI phase. But we've got the basic groundwork done now. And 2025 is the year that we'll accelerate on.
Okay, also tell me, Ankit, so you've worked with a lot of companies, right? So I'm sure you've had experience looking at different ERPs that different companies have been using, right? So are there, if you were to, categorize them, how would you categorize them and say, okay, these are like a couple of ERP solutions that startups should use versus these are some that have worked well for enterprises or, mid-market companies. Any opinion on that?
So I think early on in my consulting days, I had significant experience with SAP, one of the global ERP systems. I thought it was absolutely phenomenal. I think it's a brilliant ERP system that you can focus on, but it's meant for larger enterprises. It's not something that the startups can utilize. For startups, I think you need to be mindful about the ERP systems as well. It is not for every startup. It takes a lot of effort to implement it. It is costly, and it may or may not even be the perfect timing for you to implement it. Right. So you got it's not a very clear cut answer. It's not a black and white answer. But you need to be mindful to understand when is the right time for a company to actually implement the ERP system. Having said that, if you feel this is the right opportunity or this is the right time for to actually implement an ERP system, then there's several cloud-based solutions out there. Like we've gone with NetSuite as the ERP system, but there's like people like Zoho that you can implement as well. And you just need to figure out, does it meet the need for your business, right? If your business requires a lot of customization, then you don't want to take something for your financial system which you cannot customize. One of the things for a startup is you're still always trying to build new revenue streams. Maybe the processes are not as clean as you. Maybe the contracts are not as standardized as you'd expect, which means if you're going to go with an ERP system, you need the ability to actually adapt to it. You need the flexibility to have different contracts for different kind of customers as well. And that's something to keep in mind, right? So if your business is changing constantly, then you want to make sure that your ERP system has the flexibility to adapt to it constantly as well. But yeah, I mean, once you make the investment in it, I think it pays a dividend. So it's definitely worth looking into. If you feel that your team is struggling meeting the reporting requirements, if your team is struggling to provide some actionable insights, then do invest in an ERP system. It does help.
Okay, awesome. So I'm not going to take more than 30 minutes that were allotted. So the last two questions, we're going to go through them and we're going to wrap this up. Okay, so Ankit, when it comes to hiring, what do you place the most importance on? Is it educational pedigree or hands-on experience and the willingness to learn? What do you look for when building a strong finance team at Silkhouse?
I would say the top of the mind is neither of the three. The top of the mind is the team dynamics. If you
Okay,
want to make sure that you have the right person for the team, I live with a very simple philosophy. Life is too short to work with douchebags. Yeah, I mean, to me, that trumps everything. If you have the right person on your team, it makes everything more enjoyable. It's more difficult to discuss difficult problems. It is more enjoyable to actually solve on those difficult problems as well. So I would say focus on the right team member, which is the right mix with the existing team. The next I would say is a growth mindset. Right? You want someone who is willing to adapt, particularly so for a startup. Because the thing with startups is you're constantly evolving, which means your role can be constantly evolving. Right? There's always, oh, this is the first time we are doing something. This is the first time we've encountered an issue. And if you don't have the growth mindset and you don't have the eagerness to learn, then you will not be able to adapt. So I would focus on someone who's shown the ability to adapt in situations. Hands-on experience I would value over a pedigree. I think there is a lot of value to be had with the right education. But if you're not able to actually put it to good use, then it's not the right mindset. So yeah, if you ask me, the very first thing is the team dynamics, the fit with the team. The second thing would be the growth mindset, and then hands-on experience. And again, not to say that the pedigree doesn't matter. Right? If you have a choice of equally good individuals with the right pedigree, then why not?
got it. Last question, Ankit. So let's talk a little bit about Middle East now. So we know that the Middle East has become a hub for innovation, particularly in sectors like finance. How do you see finance evolving in the region, and how do you think fintech and digital solutions will continue to impact the finance landscape here?
I think you're right. Like Middle East has been a bit of focus, and particularly on the finance side. Just the other day, I was reading that UAE now holds about $40 billion of crypto, right? Which is phenomenal. It's a great move by the government, and they are putting the money where the mouth
Seven
is.
of
So I
us
think from
senior
that
partners, of
perspective,
which
the
there's only
regulatory
one
environment
man,
in
and the rest are
UAE
all women.
is absolutely phenomenal, and they are
Yeah,
keen to make the change. Like one of the
we
things
should. Yeah.
that they've done recently is the regulatory sandbox, which is to allow startups and companies in the fintech space to test their product within the regulatory frameworks over here and to optimize it. So that's something phenomenal for emerging fintech businesses in the region. I do believe that UAE is rightly placed. They've always come out better in terms of crisis. Right now, there is an overall slowdown in the economy globally. I'm confident that UAE will come out stronger at the end of it.
Thank you so much, Ankit.
Thank you, Aviva. Appreciate the time.
No, thank you. I really appreciate you taking out the time and doing this with us. Done. That works.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Well,
Thanks,
thank you,
Ankit.
Aviva.
Have a great
Fun in
time with
Karachi.
your family. You
Yeah.
too. Bye
Bye.
bye.